Hi, in this lesson we're going to be working on pages 8 and 9 of the Theme 8 booklet, and we're going to be looking at how we can possibly predict earthquakes and certainly how we can prepare for earthquakes. If we look at a hazard map for North America, this is the result of a great deal of work done by the United States Geological Survey. They show the areas in the United States that are most at risk from earthquakes. We can see that there are clearly some hotspots. Southern Alaska, for example, close to the convergent plate boundary there. The whole of the west coast with its complex plate tectonics with the San Andreas Fault in California and then the subduction of the Juan de Fuca plate in the far northwest. You can see there are other areas as well that have some risk. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the Sierra Nevada mountains on the Nevada-California border, and even in the Rocky Mountains running down through the Midwest. The unusual feature perhaps is directly above me here. This is called the New Madrid Fault Zone. Sort of on the border of Kentucky, Tennessee, Illinois, Missouri, and it's an area that's not really very well understood. We know there have been some big earthquakes there in the past, but generally there isn't a lot of activity there. But there's clearly the potential for more. The reasons for that we don't really understand. Anyway, if we look at some of the other ways that are used to piece together a hazard map like this, some of the ways we can monitor earthquakes, it might tell us a little bit more about them. One of the key techniques is looking for what we call seismic gaps. Now, these can be gaps in time, where there's been a lot of activity for a period of time, and then it stops. That might indicate stress is building up. We see that currently on the San Andreas Fault. Or it could be a gap in space, where there's activity along part of a fault and not activity somewhere else. So clearly there's plate movement going on, but not uniformly everywhere. Perhaps also indicating stress is building. This stress building up can lead to some effects we can measure. For example, changes in the ground level, as the ground may start to bulge as stress is building at depth. As the ground begins to bulge, it might crack, really on a small scale, but that can release a gas called radon that's often trapped inside rocks. We can measure changes in the releases of gas from the rocks that might indicate stress is building up. These cracks as well can have an effect on groundwater levels. As the rock starts to crack, water can flow into those cracks and it leads to a drop in the groundwater level. That can, again, be an indicator that stress is building. We can also see, again as a result of this building stress, a series of small earthquakes happening before a big one. Now, unfortunately, with all of these, we can perhaps detect the fact stress is building, but it doesn't really tell us when the fault is going to fail, when the actual earthquake is going to occur. There are some other slightly odder suggestions. Odd behaviour in animals, for example. I'm not a big fan of this. It's not desperately scientific, to be honest. But some people do believe it. Okay, so predicting earthquakes is going to be a very difficult thing. The best we've really come up with is being able to give people warning when an earthquake strikes in one place before the seismic waves go somewhere else. But really, the warning is going to be measured in seconds. So if advanced warning isn't going to be possible, or certainly not with the technology we have at the moment, it's important then we look to reduce the risk. Some of that is going to come down to planning. That can be on a governmental scale or even down to an individual family plan. Okay, what would your family do if there was a major earthquake event? Where would you go? Who would you meet? Who would you inform that you were okay? The design of buildings is crucial. We saw in the previous lesson how the quality of buildings has a major impact on the devastation caused during an earthquake. Now, there's a number of different ways this can be done. You'll see in your booklets on page 9 the spaces to make notes about each of these techniques. One of the most effective is what we call base isolators. Base isolators separate the ground from the building, so the ground can shake and the building stays in position. If you want to see how this works, watch the linked video looking at the Los Angeles Emergency Planning Center, the most earthquake-proof building in Los Angeles. Other ways of doing this might include bracing the outside of the building, preventing too much shaking, making it stronger. This is used perhaps to reinforce older buildings that perhaps haven't been built to a sufficiently high standard. It is expensive though, and it's perhaps going to be limited in how much shaking it can prevent. It's important as well not just to think about the building, but to think about the services that go into a building. Making pipes flexible, for example, so they don't fracture, particularly things like gas pipes, but also water pipes and sewage pipes are going to be important in maintaining life after the earthquake. Again, watch the Los Angeles Emergency Center video. It'll show you some idea of what's involved there. Some tall buildings in earthquake-proof areas are designed to actually absorb the energy, to sway with the shaking, rather than resisting the shaking rigidly. This can be a way of dissipating the energy. So the energy goes in making the building move, rather than in breaking the things that hold the building together. If you watch the video on the Tokyo Skytree, that'll show you how that works. It can be done on a simpler scale, creating buildings that are less likely to fall down. Okay, if you go to New Zealand, it can be done on a smaller scale with individual buildings. For example, if you ever travel to New Zealand, you'll see that the houses there look quite flimsy. The idea is that if they do fall down, the amount of injury they'll cause is much lower than if it's perhaps a more solidly built house like the ones we're used to. If we look back in history, in China, for example, prone to big earthquakes, the design of these pagodas, hundreds of years old, is actually surprisingly earthquake-proof. The pyramidal shape, with a wide base and a narrower top, helps to absorb some of this earthquake energy. To go completely high tech, though, one of the tallest buildings in the world, called Taipei 101, on the island of Taiwan, this building has its movement controlled by a very large weight near the top of the building that moves in the opposite direction to the swaying, to try and counteract that movement. There's a video linked in the lesson notes to show you how this works. I found this on the internet. It's designed for perhaps the most earthquake-proof house. It's an interesting idea. You can see diagonal bracing on the outside. You can see the spherical shape, no corners to break. The surfaces all on flexible pipes. Even the windows are around to prevent build-up of stress at corners. I would love to show you a photograph of this house being made, but it doesn't exist. It's a nice idea, but one I suspect that would actually be quite difficult to live in. Trying to find furniture with a round edge, for example, to fit against the walls might be a challenge. Perhaps more realistic is a design like this, taking some of the ideas from the Chinese pagoda and creating this sort of more pyramidal shaped building with this outer reinforcing layer made of irregular shapes and rounded shapes and edges. So, it is possible to design buildings to resist earthquakes. However, the more work that's done to make them more earthquake proof, the more expensive they'll become. And there are no guarantees with this either. We can predict perhaps how much shaking is likely to occur, but we can't be sure that that's what it's going to be like. For example, in Christchurch in 2011 in New Zealand, many of the buildings there which had resisted earthquakes successfully in the past fell down in 2011 because the acceleration of the ground, the speed at which the ground moved, was very, very high. It was much greater than had been anticipated, and as a result, buildings failed. It's not an exact science, but it's perhaps the best that we have. Make sure you've got notes on page 9 there. Next time, we're going to move on to start thinking about volcanoes.